All right, strap in, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep into the minds of murderers. We're talking criminal psychology, the real deal, with Dr. Richard Taylor's book, The Mind of a Murderer. And let me tell you, you've given me some pretty intense material to work with here. Yeah, Dr. Taylor, he doesn't shy away from the darkness, that's for sure. It's fascinating stuff, but definitely disturbing at times, too. I got to ask you, right off the bat, this whole nature versus nurture debate, it's a classic, right? What makes a murderer? Is it baked in from birth? Or is it like the environment that screws them up? The book kind of hints at both playing a role, but it's not so simple, is it?
No, it's definitely not a simple answer. Like, you can't just say, oh, this person was born a killer and call it a day. In fact, Dr. Taylor, he actually goes out of his way to debunk that whole murder gene thing. But there's no denying that our brains, the way they're wired, can play a big role in predisposing some people to violence.
Okay, so walk me through this. I'm fascinated by the whole brain-behavior connection, especially in extreme cases like this.
Well, let's start with the prefrontal cortex, okay? So that's the part of your brain right behind your forehead. It's kind of like the control center for things like impulse control, decision-making, all that stuff that keeps us from, acting on every crazy thought that pops into our heads.
So, like, it stops us from doing stupid stuff, basically.
Basically, yeah. But when this part of the brain is damaged, either through like a physical injury or, developmental problems, it can make someone way more prone to lashing out, to being aggressive.
So it's like their internal brakes are faulty. They might even know right from wrong, but they can't seem to stop themselves.
Exactly. It's a lack of control. And then you've got the amygdala. This part of the brain, it's all about processing fear and aggression. Now, when the amygdala is overactive, it can make someone see threats everywhere, even when there aren't any. It's like they're constantly on edge, ready to explode.
And, I mean, you throw in a bad environment, a traumatic childhood, and it feels like a recipe for disaster, doesn't it?
You're telling me. Dr. Taylor actually talks about this one case, really sad, actually. It's about this guy who was abused really badly as a kid. And, as an adult, his crimes, they were almost like a mirror of the violence he experienced as a child.
It's chilling, really, to think about how early trauma can have such a lasting impact. But the book also makes it clear that it's not always so clear-cut, right? Like, not everyone who goes through something awful ends up becoming a murderer.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole field so tricky. There are tons of cases where people came from, like, seemingly normal backgrounds and still ended up doing terrible things. And this is where the whole concept of psychopathy comes into play. It adds another layer of crazy to the puzzle.
Okay, yeah, psychopaths, gotta admit, they kind of fascinate me. But in a morbid way, like trying to understand how someone can be so different.
It's definitely a head scratcher. The thing about psychopaths, the thing that Dr. Taylor really hammers home is their total lack of empathy. They can't, truly grasp the concept, remorse, guilt, genuine connection. It's all foreign to them.
So it's almost like they're missing, like, a core piece of what it means to be human. Like,
Yeah.
that ability to connect emotionally, it's just gone.
You got it. And because of this missing piece, they can do these incredibly violent things, and it's calculated cold, detached. It's hard for us normal people to even wrap our heads around it.
And of course, Dr. Taylor, he doesn't just leave it at that. He goes on to, like, categorize murderers, right? It's almost like a taxonomy of evil or something, which honestly is kind of fascinating and terrifying at the same time.
I know what you mean. I guess it's his way of trying to bring some order to the chaos, right? To figure out what the different paths are that lead people to do such horrible things. He breaks them down into these distinct categories, each with their own unique motivations, their own patterns of behavior.
So break it down for me. What are some of the key differences he points out?
Well, we've talked about psychopaths already. They're kind of in a league of their own. But then you've got your spree killers. These are the folks who are driven by this sudden rage, completely impulsive. Often it's triggered by some perceived injustice, something that pushes them over the edge.
So it's like they're lashing out, but in a really extreme way.
Exactly. Like, Dr. Taylor gives this example of a guy who had just gone through, a string of failures, lost his job, his relationship fell apart, money problems, the whole 9 yards, and he just snapped. He started targeting anyone he thought had wronged him, taking revenge.
It's scary, right? Because
Yeah.
that feeling of being wronged, wanting to strike back, I mean, it's something most of us have felt at some point, but most of us would never dream of doing something violent.
True. And then there's the serial killers. These guys, they're different. It's all premeditated, planned out. They're often driven by this need for power, control, or sometimes, and this is the really disturbing part, it's about sexual gratification.
Those are the cases that really capture the public imagination, right? the ones that make headlines. The ritualistic stuff, it's like something out of a horror movie.
Yeah, and those rituals, those patterns, they're often what help investigators connect the dots, figure out who they're dealing with, and start to understand, like, the twisted logic inside the killer's head.
So we've got psychopaths, spree killers, serial killers.
Mm.
What other dark corners of the human mind does Dr. Taylor eliminate for us?
Well, he also talks about family annihilators. And this is maybe the most heartbreaking category of all. We're talking about people who kill their entire families. Usually it's because of extreme stress, maybe financial ruin, or even this warped sense of, like, protecting their loved ones.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that. Like, what could possibly drive someone to do such a thing?
It often comes down to a really distorted view of reality. They convince themselves that death is the only way to, like, save their family from suffering or shame. Dr. Taylor talks about this one case where a father, he was about to lose everything, declared bankruptcy. He was so overwhelmed by the thought of failure that he killed his wife and kids because, in his mind, they were better off dead than living in poverty.
That's just, I don't even know what to say. It's a tragically twisted logic, a terrible example of how, like, mental and emotional pressure can lead to such devastating consequences. Is that all the categories? Or are there more?
There's one more, yeah, impulsive killers. These are the folks whose violence comes out of nowhere, fueled by, like, drugs or alcohol, maybe a sudden burst of anger, a loss of control.
Crimes of passion, right.
Yeah.
Those seem like the hardest to predict, to prevent.
Exactly. It's like a pressure cooker exploding, and sometimes even the person who did it, they can't fully explain what triggered them. It shows just how powerful emotions can be and how dangerous they can become when they spiral out of control.
Man, this is heavy stuff. And we've only just scratched the surface. I'm really interested in this idea that Dr. Taylor actually sat down and interviewed these murderers,
Yeah.
like face to face with evil. That had to be intense.
Yeah, you can read all the files you want, look at the crime scene photos, but actually hearing the perpetrators themselves, the way they talk about their crimes, their motivations, it gives you a completely different perspective.
That's what I want to dive into next. What did he learn from those conversations? Did he find any common threads, any insights that tie all these different types of murderers together?
Well, one of the most striking things, one thing that really stood out to me was just how different their responses were. Some of them, they spoke with this chilling calmness, almost like they were describing a trip to the supermarket, not the taking of a human life.
It goes back to that emotional disconnect, right? That inability to comprehend the magnitude of what they've done.
Right. Dr. Taylor, he uses the term psychopathic personality to describe these individuals. Empathy, remorse, it's just not in their vocabulary. They see murder as a solution to a problem, a means to an end. The human cost doesn't even register.
It's dehumanizing, the way they talk about it. Like, the victim was nothing more than an obstacle in their path.
That's a key insight that Dr. Taylor really highlights. For a lot of these guys, especially the ones with psychopathic tendencies, other people are just objects, tools to be used and then discarded when they're no longer useful.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
To be seen as nothing more than a thing by another person. But Dr. Taylor contrasts that coldness with another case, right? One where the killer is completely overwhelmed by guilt.
He does. It's this young woman who stabbed her boyfriend in a moment of rage. And unlike that cold, calculated detachment we saw in the first case, this woman was absolutely devastated by what she'd done. She was crying through the whole interview, talking about how much she regretted it, how she couldn't believe she was capable of such a thing.
So it's like two opposite ends of the emotional spectrum. The psychopath, ice cold, and then this woman completely consumed by remorse.
That's exactly the point Dr. Taylor is trying to make. It highlights the complexity of the human mind. There's no one-size-fits-all murderer profile. Even within those categories, you've got a huge range of emotional responses, motivations, levels of self-awareness.
It reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the whole nature versus nurture debate. Do you think it's possible that the woman who killed her boyfriend, that her violence was more a product of her environment, the abuse she suffered, while the psychopathic businessman, maybe his brain was just wired differently from the start?
That's a really good question, and it's something that Dr. Taylor wrestles with throughout the book. He acknowledges that both nature and nurture play a role, but the way they interact, it's incredibly complex. It's not like a simple formula where trauma equals violence or a brain abnormality equals psychopath.
I'm curious about the ethical side of this. Like,
Yeah.
on the one hand, we want to understand what drives people to do such terrible things. But on the other hand, are we in danger of making these acts seem, I don't know, almost normal? Or even worse, creating sympathy for the perpetrators?
That's a really important point. And Dr. Taylor, he addresses this directly. He talks about how crucial it is to find that balance between seeking understanding and avoiding sensationalism. The point of his work, he says, is to shine a light on these dark corners of the human psyche, not to condone or excuse violence.
It's a reminder that every act of violence, it leaves behind victims, families, communities that are forever changed by it. We can't lose sight of that.
You're absolutely right. And that leads us to another big question that Dr. Taylor tackles: prevention.
Mhm.
If we can start to grasp the factors that contribute to violence, can we also find ways to stop it before it happens?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, we can punish people after the fact, but what can we do to stop these tragedies from happening in the first place?
Dr. Taylor argues that while we might never completely eliminate violence, we can definitely reduce it. He talks a lot about the importance of early intervention, especially when it comes to dealing with childhood trauma and mental health issues.
So it's about recognizing the warning signs, offering support before things escalate,
Yeah,
creating a safety net, basically.
exactly. He uses this great analogy. It's way easier to reinforce a dam before it bursts than it is to clean up the mess
I
afterwards.
like that. So what concrete steps does he suggest we take? How do we, like, strengthen that dam?
Well, he points to a few key areas. Early childhood intervention programs, for one. These programs, they focus on supporting families, addressing things like poverty, abuse, neglect. That can have a huge impact on a kid's development, reduce their chances of becoming violent later on.
So it's about getting to the root of the problem, those early experiences that can shape a person's worldview and behavior.
Yeah. And then there's the issue of access to mental health care. And not just for people who are already showing signs of violence, but for everyone. He argues that if we made mental health care as normal and accessible as, like, going to the doctor for a checkup, it could make a huge difference.
It's about taking away the stigma, making people feel comfortable seeking help before things reach a crisis point.
Exactly. And of course, there's the issue of gun control. That one's always a hot button topic.
Yeah, definitely a lot of strong opinions on that one.
Dr. Taylor doesn't shy away from it, but he's careful about how he approaches it. He makes a strong case for limiting access to firearms, especially for people with a history of violence or mental instability.
I mean, it's hard to argue with the statistics, right? Countries with stricter gun control laws, they tend to have less gun violence overall.
That's right. Dr. Taylor isn't saying that gun control is a cure-all, but it's definitely a piece of the puzzle.
So it sounds like Dr. Taylor's book is more than just a fascinating look inside the criminal mind. It's a call to action for society as a whole.
You could say that. He's challenging us to move beyond simplistic solutions, to really grapple with the complexity of the issue, to think about what kind of world we want to live in.
Do we want a world that focuses on punishment, or one that invests in prevention, in rehabilitation, in addressing the underlying causes of violence?
Those are big questions. But Dr. Taylor's work, it gives us a framework for starting that conversation.
It's a conversation we need to be having, not just in like academic circles, but everywhere,
Hmm.
in our homes, schools, communities.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that violence, it affects all of us, whether we realize it or not.
We all have a responsibility to create a safer, more just world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Dr. Taylor's book, it's a powerful tool for understanding and change.
I love that perspective. Even in the face of all this darkness, there's still hope. And it's our job to nurture that hope, to work towards a future where violence is no longer the answer. Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today. This has been a really intense, thought-provoking exploration of the criminal mind. We'll be back after a quick break to wrap up our discussion of the mind of a murderer and share some final thoughts.
One that really got to me, one of the interviews, it was with this guy convicted of killing his business partner. He was just so matter of fact about it, like he was talking about the weather or something.
Yeah, it's that lack of emotion, right? Like taking a human life and there's just nothing.
It's like it doesn't even faze them. This guy, textbook psychopath, according to Dr. Taylor, no empathy, zero remorse. He saw the murder as just like a business decision, a problem that needed solving.
It's almost like the victim was, I don't know, an inconvenience to him, not even a person.
And that's a big part of what Dr. Taylor's getting at. For these types, especially the psychopaths, other people, they're just pawns in their game.
It's a scary thought, to be seen as disposable like that. But then Dr. Taylor throws in this other case, completely different, right? Where the killer is just drowning in guilt.
Yeah, totally different vibe. This one was a young woman. She stabbed her boyfriend in a fit of rage, and she was just wrecked with guilt, sobbing the whole time, saying how sorry she was, how she never meant for it to happen.
Night and day compared to that other guy. One's all cold and detached, the other's completely broken by what they did.
And that's what makes this stuff so fascinating, you know? There's no single murderer mold. It's not that simple.
It makes you think about that whole nature versus nurture thing again. Like, with that woman, maybe the violence was more about her environment, the abuse she went through. But the businessman, maybe it was just how his brain was wired.
Right.
Okay.
It's a tough one. And Dr. Taylor, he's honest about the fact that we don't have all the answers. Both nature and nurture, they matter, but how they come together, it's complicated.
It's like trying to untangle a giant knot. But speaking of complicated, what about the ethics of all this? Like, by trying to understand these killers, are we somehow making excuses for them?
That's a valid concern. And Dr. Taylor, he definitely acknowledges that. He says the goal isn't to justify or glorify violence, but to try and understand it, to shed some light on these dark impulses.
Because ultimately, there are victims, right?
Yeah.
Real people who are hurt, families that are shattered. We can't forget that.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the big question, the one that Dr. Taylor keeps coming back to. How do we prevent this? If we can understand the roots of violence, can we also stop it from happening?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Punishing people after the fact, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But stopping it before it happens, that's the real challenge.
And Dr. Taylor, he believes we can. He talks about the importance of early intervention, especially for kids who have experienced trauma, who are struggling with mental health issues.
So catching it early, offering support before things spiral out of control.
Exactly. He uses this analogy about a dam. It's much easier to reinforce the dam before it breaks than to try and clean up the flood afterwards, right?
That makes sense. What else does he suggest? How do we, shore up those defenses?
He talks about early childhood programs, supporting families, making sure kids have a stable environment, addressing things like poverty and abuse. Those things, they can make a huge difference in the long run.
It's about creating a world where kids have a chance, where violence isn't the only option.
Right. And then there's access to mental health care, not just for people who are already in crisis, but for everyone. He thinks that if we made mental health care as normal as going to the dentist, we could prevent a lot of these tragedies.
Destigmatizing it, making it easier to get help so people don't have to suffer in silence.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the whole gun control debate.
Yeah, that one's always a tough one.
Dr. Taylor, he doesn't shy away from it. He presents some pretty compelling arguments for making it harder for people with a history of violence or mental health issues to get their hands on guns.
I mean, the numbers don't lie, right?
Yeah.
Countries with stricter gun laws tend to have less gun violence.
That's right. He's not saying it's the only solution, but it's definitely part of the equation.
So it seems like Dr. Taylor's book is more than just a study of murderers. It's a call to action.
Definitely. He's challenging us to look beyond the simple answers, to think about the big picture, the systemic issues that contribute to violence.
It's about asking ourselves, what kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to focus on punishment? Or do we want to focus on prevention, on rehabilitation?
Those are the real questions, aren't they? And Dr. Taylor's work, it gives us a starting point for that conversation.
And it's a conversation we need to be having, not just in academic circles, but everywhere.
Yeah.
In our families, in our communities, in our government.
Because this is an issue that affects all of us, whether we realize it or not.
We all have a responsibility to create a world where everyone feels safe and valued.
Well said. Dr. Taylor's book, it's a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the human mind, there's still hope.
I like that. Even in the midst of all the darkness, there's still that glimmer of hope. And it's our job to keep that hope alive, to work towards a better future.
Beautifully put.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a really thought-provoking journey into the complexities of the criminal mind. We'll be back after a quick break to wrap up our discussion of the mind of a murderer and share some final takeaways. We're back, and I gotta say, this deep dive has been, well, intense. Really gets you thinking, doesn't it?
No doubt. It's heavy stuff, that's for sure, but important, you know, we don't shy away from these topics here.
For sure. And Dr. Taylor, he lays it all out there, doesn't he? What do you think will stick with people after this? What are the big takeaways?
The biggest one for me, it's that there's no typical murderer. You can't just look at someone and say, oh yeah, they're gonna kill somebody.
Like in the movies, right? Where it's also black and white, good guy, bad guy. Life's not like that.
Nope. And Dr. Taylor, he drives that point home. It's messy, it's complicated. Biology, psychology, their past, society, it all gets thrown in the mix.
And just when you think you've got it figured out, you get a case that throws you for a loop.
Exactly. So approaching it with A little humility, that's key. No easy answers here.
It's about seeing each person as an individual, right? Like even the ones who do these horrible things.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't excuse what they did, but helps us understand it a bit better.
And Dr. Taylor, he's not just about understanding it, right? He wants to prevent it. That
Ah.
comes through loud and clear in the book.
Oh, yeah. He's all about prevention. And for me, that's the most hopeful part, you know? He really believes we can make a difference. That if we get a handle on the risk factors, the trauma, the mental health issues, we can create a society where violence is less likely.
That damn analogy he uses.
Okay.
A good one, right? Fix the cracks before the whole thing bursts.
Powerful image. And it's not just about, like, government programs or whatever. It's about us, about how we treat each other, building a culture of empathy.
Yeah, that's huge. Checking in on your friends, supporting organizations that are doing good work in the community. We all have a part to play.
Absolutely. That's what I hope people take away from this. The conversation doesn't end here. We got to keep talking about this, keep pushing for change.
Couldn't agree more. If this deep dive sparks something in you, go check out the book, The Mind of a Murderer. It's a tough read, but it'll make you think. And keep those conversations going. Talk to people. Get involved. Let's work towards a world where everyone feels safe, where violence isn't the answer. That's what we're all about here, right? Keep those minds open and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.